When an empath stops forgiving, Carl Jung discovered that every mask in their life falls away, not just from others, but from themselves. The people who seemed loving reveal their manipulation. The relationships built on kindness expose their exploitation. And most shocking of all, the empath discovers they've been wearing the biggest mask of all, the mask of endless forgiveness that was slowly killing their soul. Picture this moment. You've forgiven them again. The person who betrayed your trust, who took your kindness for weakness, who treated your empathy like a renewable resource. You smile, you say, "It's okay." You absorb their guilt so they can sleep peacefully while you lie awake questioning your own worth. But something different happens this time. Instead of the familiar relief of keeping the peace, you feel something else. Rage. Not the explosive kind, but the quiet, sacred rage of a soul that has finally had enough. Jung called this the collision with the shadow, the moment when everything you've suppressed comes crashing into consciousness. And for the empath, this collision changes everything. But here's what Jung discovered that nobody talks about. The empath's endless forgiveness isn't actually compassion. It's what I call survival forgiveness. It's a trauma response disguised as virtue. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his practice. He wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." The empath forgives not from strength, but from terror. Terror of abandonment, terror of conflict, terror of being seen as bad. They learned early that their worth was tied to their ability to absorb pain without complaint. Jung called this the sacrifice of the authentic self for social acceptance. But when the empath stops forgiving, something revolutionary happens. The entire social ecosystem built around their self-sacrifice begins to collapse. And that's when the masks start falling, first from others, then from themselves. Jung's most radical insight was about what he called the shadow, everything we reject about ourselves and project onto others. For empaths, the shadow contains something unexpected, their own capacity for healthy selfishness, righteous anger, and sacred boundaries. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For empaths, this darkness isn't evil. It's their suppressed self-preservation instincts. The part of them that knows when they're being exploited, but has been silenced by the need to be good. When empaths stop forgiving, they're not becoming cruel. They're integrating their shadow. They're reclaiming the parts of themselves they abandoned to maintain relationships that were never truly mutual. Jung identified specific patterns when highly sensitive people reclaim their psychological boundaries, what I call the 8 signs of sacred rebellion. And if you recognize these in yourself, you're experiencing what Jung called the birth of authentic selfhood. Sign 1. The energy stops leaking. The first sign is what I call the energy reversal. Instead of automatically absorbing everyone's emotional waste, you start questioning, is this mine to carry? Jung observed that individuation always begins with this boundary between self and other. You notice how drained you feel after certain interactions. You start recognizing the difference between genuine remorse and manipulative guilt-tripping. Most importantly, you stop feeling responsible for other people's emotional regulation. Jung wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." The awakening empath finally looks inward and sees their own depleted state. Comment if you've learned to trust your intuition completely. I no longer doubt what I see and feel. But here's what's remarkable. Others sense this shift before you even announce it. Energy vampires start avoiding you because you're no longer feeding them. Sign 2. The performance ends. Jung called it the death of the persona, the social mask we wear to be accepted. For empaths, This persona is the endlessly understanding one, but when they stop forgiving automatically, this mask becomes impossible to maintain. You stop saying it's fine when it's not fine. You stop making excuses for bad behavior. You stop performing emotional availability for people who have never been emotionally available to you. This is what I call the end of emotional labor without reciprocity. Jung warned that dropping the persona would feel terrifying. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But becoming authentic means disappointing people who preferred your performance. Sign 3. The manipulation becomes visible. This is where Jung's understanding of projection becomes crucial. When empaths stop automatically forgiving, they stop participating in what I call the empathy exploitation cycle. They begin seeing manipulation tactics they were blind to before. You recognize love bombing, excessive praise designed to extract forgiveness. You spot guilt trips disguised as vulnerability. You see how your compassion was weaponized against your boundaries. Jung wrote, "Everything unconscious is projected." The awakening empath stops projecting their own integrity onto others. They see people as they are, not as they hope they could be. Sign 4. The guilt loses its power. Jung observed that guilt is often internalized shame from others who benefit from our compliance. When empaths stop forgiving reflexively, they experience what I call guilt immunity. They recognize guilt as a control mechanism. You stop feeling guilty for having standards. You stop apologizing for your boundaries. You recognize that people who try to guilt you back into forgiveness are revealing their investment in your self-abandonment. Jung called this the integration of healthy selfishness. It's not cruelty, it's self-preservation finally coming online. Sign 5. The relationships sort themselves. Jung believed that authentic transformation always changes relationships. When empaths stop forgiving everyone, what I call the great sorting begins. Relationships based on exploitation dissolve, while authentic connections deepen. Some people will disappear when you stop being their emotional dumping ground. Others will try to guilt you back into your old role. But a few will respect your boundaries and meet you in genuine reciprocity. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But this only happens when both people show up authentically." Comment if people started treating you differently when you found your backbone. They sensed the change before I announced it. Sign 6. The anger becomes sacred. Jung understood that anger is often suppressed wisdom. When empaths stop forgiving, they access what I call sacred rage, not the destructive kind, but the protective force that says no more. You feel angry about past violations you minimized. You're furious about boundaries you never set. This anger isn't toxic, it's information. It's your psyche telling you where you abandoned yourself. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. The pain of seeing how you've been treated becomes the fire that forges your new boundaries." Sign 7. The pattern recognition activates. Jung's work on psychological types reveals that empaths often have highly developed intuitive abilities. When they stop forgiving automatically, what I call pattern recognition goes into overdrive. You start seeing the same manipulation tactics across different people. You recognize the cycle: transgression, fake remorse, love bombing, repeat. You spot emotional predators before they fully reveal themselves. This isn't paranoia, it's developed discernment. Jung called this differentiated consciousness, the ability to see clearly without emotional fog. Sign 8. The self emerges. The final sign is what Jung called encounter with the self, not the ego or the persona, but the integrated totality of who you are. When empaths stop forgiving reflexively, their authentic self begins to emerge. You discover preferences you never knew you had because you were always accommodating others. You find your voice after years of silence. You realize you have needs, desires, and boundaries that are just as valid as everyone else's. If you recognize yourself in these transformation patterns, write this: "My breaking point became my breakthrough." Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The empath who stops forgiving finally claims this privilege. But Jung didn't romanticize this process. He called it the dark night of the soul, a period where old patterns die before new ones are born. For empaths, this phase feels like social death because so much of their identity was built on being forgiving. You might lose friends who only valued your compliance. Family members might accuse you of changing. You might feel guilty for setting boundaries you should have set years ago. Jung warned, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." The empath must descend into their own psychological underworld, facing all the rage and pain they've suppressed, before they can rise into authentic selfhood. When empaths stop forgiving automatically, something remarkable happens to the people around them. What I call the great unmasking begins. People can no longer hide behind the empath's endless understanding. The narcissist can't use your empathy to avoid accountability. The manipulator can't twist your compassion into compliance. The emotional vampire can't feed on your endless forgiveness. Your clarity forces them to show their true nature. Jung understood this dynamic. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But he also knew that sometimes people aren't irritated by their own reflection. They're irritated by your refusal to carry their shadow for them. But the most shocking revelation comes when the empath's own mask falls. They realize that endless forgiveness was their own form of manipulation, a way to maintain relationships through self-sacrifice rather than authentic connection. Jung called this the recognition of one's own shadow. The empath must face the uncomfortable truth that their forgiveness was often driven by fear, not love. Fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as bad. This recognition isn't shameful, it's liberating. It means you can finally love from wholeness rather than woundedness, give from choice rather than compulsion. Jung distinguished between unconscious and conscious psychological processes. When empaths stop automatic forgiveness, they develop what I call conscious forgiveness. Forgiveness that serves the soul, not the ego. This forgiveness doesn't happen immediately after wrongdoing. It comes after truth-telling, after boundary setting, after the natural consequences have been felt. It's forgiveness that includes justice, not forgiveness that bypasses it. Jung wrote, "Forgiveness is not the suppression of a justifiable reaction. True forgiveness honors the wound while releasing the grudge. It sees clearly while choosing not to be consumed by resentment." Jung understood that psychological energy follows certain laws. When empaths stop leaking energy through automatic forgiveness, that energy becomes available for what I call creative self-expression. They finally have resources for their own dreams, goals, and healing. You start creating instead of just consuming others' dramas. You begin pursuing interests you abandoned to be available for everyone else's crises. You invest in relationships that energize you rather than drain you. This isn't selfishness. Jung called it individuation. It's the natural development of a complete human being who can contribute to the world from fullness rather than emptiness. Jung believed that individual transformation creates collective change. When empaths stop forgiving automatically, they model a different way of being for everyone around them. What I call the authenticity virus begins to spread. Your courage to set boundaries gives others permission to set theirs. Your refusal to enable dysfunction exposes the system that depends on empathic compliance. Your authentic self-expression reminds others they don't have to perform to be loved. This is why the transformation feels so threatening to some people. You're not just changing yourself, you're changing the rules of engagement for everyone in your orbit. Jung's concept of individuation includes the ability to form what he called conscious relationships, connections between two whole people rather than two wounded halves seeking completion. When empaths stop automatic forgiveness, they become available for this level of connection. You attract people who can meet your authenticity with their own. You form relationships based on mutual respect rather than mutual wounding. You love from overflow rather than lack. These conscious relationships don't need constant forgiveness because they're built on honesty from the start. Conflicts get addressed immediately rather than suppressed until they explode. Jung's individuation process involves integrating all aspects of the psyche, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious. For empaths, this means integrating their capacity for both compassion and discernment. You learn to feel deeply without absorbing everything. You develop the ability to see others' pain without making it your responsibility. You become what I call compassionately detached, caring without carrying. This integration creates what Jung called psychological wholeness, the ability to respond from your full range of human capacities rather than just your wounded empathic patterns. Jung understood that psychological development has a spiritual dimension. When empaths stop forgiving automatically, they often experience what I call sacred disillusionment, the painful but necessary death of spiritual bypassing. You realize that endless forgiveness wasn't spiritual evolution, it was spiritual stagnation. True spiritual growth requires facing shadow, setting boundaries, and honoring your own divine nature as much as others. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." This includes becoming someone who forgives consciously, loves authentically, and serves from wholeness. Jung was among the first to recognize the connection between psychological and physical health. When empaths stop absorbing everyone's emotions, their bodies often begin to heal from what I call energetic toxicity. Chronic fatigue starts lifting when you stop processing everyone's emotional waste. Anxiety decreases when you're no longer hypervigilant about others' moods. Autoimmune issues often improve when you stop attacking your own boundaries. Your nervous system finally gets to rest when it's not constantly activated by others' dysregulation. This is the body's natural response to psychological boundaries. Jung observed that individuation leads to what he called the development of wisdom. Empaths who have learned conscious forgiveness often become what I call wounded healers, people who can help others without losing themselves. You can now recognize empathic wounding in others without being triggered by it. You can offer guidance without taking responsibility for outcomes. You become a lighthouse, providing illumination without chasing ships in the dark. This wisdom isn't cold or detached. It's warm but boundaried, caring but not carrying, loving but not losing yourself. Jung believed that individual healing contributes to collective healing. When empaths learn conscious forgiveness, they break generational patterns of empathic exploitation. What I call the cycle breaker effect begins. You model healthy relationships for your children. You refuse to participate in family dysfunction. You show others that empathy doesn't require self-erasure. You become living proof that sensitive people can be both soft and strong. This legacy extends beyond your immediate circle. Every boundary you set gives someone else permission to set theirs. Every time you choose conscious forgiveness over automatic forgiveness, you contribute to collective healing. Jung loved psychological paradoxes because they often revealed deeper truths. The paradox of the empath's journey is this: when you stop forgiving everyone, you finally learn to forgive yourself. When you stop absorbing everyone's guilt, you release your own shame. You forgive yourself for staying too long in toxic situations. You forgive yourself for betraying your own boundaries. You forgive yourself for mistaking trauma bonds for love. This self-forgiveness is the deepest healing of all. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." The empath who stops forgiving others finally becomes able to forgive themselves, not for being human, but for forgetting their own divine worth. So here's what I want you to understand. Your forgiveness is sacred. It's not meant to be given away like candy to anyone who demands it. It's meant to be offered consciously, when the soul is ready, when justice has been served, when truth has been honored. Jung spent his life studying the process of becoming whole, and he found that it always requires saying no to what diminishes you, so you can say yes to what honors you. If you recognize yourself in these 8 signs, you're already on the path Jung mapped out. Trust the process, trust your anger, trust your boundaries, trust that becoming who you truly are is not selfish, it's necessary. Your refusal to forgive automatically doesn't make you hard, it makes you real. And the world needs more real empaths, people who love from fullness, serve from choice, and forgive from wisdom. When an empath stops forgiving, every mask falls away. The masks others wore to manipulate your kindness, the masks you wore to avoid their anger. And in that sacred stripping away, something beautiful emerges, your authentic self. You discover you don't need to be perfect to be loved. You don't need to be endlessly understanding to be valuable. You don't need to carry everyone's pain to prove your worth. Jung's greatest gift to empaths is this understanding. Individuation, becoming who you truly are, is not just your right, it's your responsibility. Not just to yourself, but to a world that needs conscious empaths, boundaried healers, and people who love from wholeness rather than woundedness. If you want to dive deeper into the empath's journey towards psychological sovereignty, check out my video on what happens when the empath stops pleasing everyone and starts seeing the truth, where I explore the complete transformation from people-pleasing to authentic empowerment. Your journey from automatic forgiveness to conscious choice isn't just personal healing, it's revolutionary. And Jung would be proud. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.